Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean. And today we are talking about Life in Reterra. And our copy was provided for review, but the thoughts in this video are all our own. And Life in Reterra is a 2 to 4 player game designed by Erik M. Lang and Ken Gruhl.
Life in Reterra is a tile placement game that takes place in the distant future when nature has reclaimed the land and humanity is trying to rebuild using relics of the past. But before we get too into it, let's look at how it plays.
At the start of the game, choose one of the 3 building sets or mix and match, and then take one of the starter tiles and 3 random tiles and you're ready to build. Each turn, you choose one land tile, either from the 5 currently available to everyone or the 3 that you got at the start, and then you place that tile adjacent to any other tile in your map. You are trying to do a few things here. First, you want to build areas of 7 or more matching land spaces. Also, you want to put these gears together on matching land, because once you make a group of matching gears, you can choose to take one of the buildings, which will do stuff like gaining you points, or relics, or chucking junk at your neighbors, amongst many other things. If you have a single gear, you can instead choose to cover it with an inhabitant. There are also other things on tiles like relics, which are worth points, and energy sources, which are worth a lot of points when surrounded. You keep on taking turns one tile at a time until everyone has created a 4x4 grid, and then you add up your points from matching groups of 7 plus of the same land, relic icons, energy sources, inhabitants, and buildings. And you lose points for any junk that you have in your land. And then the greatest revitalizer is named.
Life in Reterra is a tile placement puzzle game. The key thing is you are restricted to that 4x4 grid, but there are various things that you're trying to do. You're trying to make your terrains 7 wide, you're trying to line up your gears to get the different buildings, and you're also keeping an eye on what your opponent is doing, because there is sometimes a little bit of interaction with the buildings or with what they're trying to get to.
Yeah, and I think the big thing that sets this game apart are those buildings, is because you got 3 different boxes of buildings, and a lot of those do different things. We'll come back to that when we chat about replayability in just a second, but I think a lot of folks are going to look at this and think of, King Domino Origins, Moon River, games like that, and I think that's probably pretty fair, but it does have kind of that other layer. And the other thing that it's got that I found interesting was its theme, and it's because it's that kind of post-apocalyptic, but it's like that weird apocalypse that was like nature took over kind of apocalypse, and then we're coming back out of that. And it reminds me of Kipo in the Age of the Wonder Beasts, and I love Kipo in the Age of the Wonder Beasts. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's the best cartoon to come out since Avatar: The Last Airbender. I love it so much. And I think just because it kind of taps into that a little bit, that makes it a little bit different and brings me into it.
Yeah, and I think the theme is captured in the buildings, and that brings us on to replayability. So like you mentioned before, there are 3 boxes of buildings, and every game you play with 5 buildings out. So when you first play, you can just play with the different boxes as they're meant to be. But then after that, you can mix and match the buildings however you want, and each of the buildings do different things.
Yeah, all of the buildings have, well, not all of them, but there are kind of different focuses through those boxes and through those buildings. So some of them are kind of take daddy a little bit, where you're throwing junk on other people's stuff. That's kind of the big thing that you're doing to other folks. But there's also stuff where it's going to focus a bit more on having relics, or it's going to let you gain more relics, or it's going to affect the inhabitants, which are these great little meeples that go on your thing, or it's going to affect It's going to make the groups that you're making a little bit stronger, a little bit more specific. So it is nice that there are different avenues you can go down, because this game is kind of trying to bridge that gap between the hobby gamer and the mass market gamer, which means that they've got kind of a wider pool of gamers they're trying to grab onto. And so you see them, at least attempting to do that a bit with these buildings, where you can play mean, or you can, for gamers who like their own stuff, or for gamers who like to mess with each other's stuff, there is stuff in there to kind of drive it both directions.
Yeah, and there are ones that are a little bit simpler too, such as it will get points if it's on the outside, and other ones you have to work towards. So I think that's good for the different levels of gamers too. And if you ever work your way up to one of the bigger buildings, the 2x2, that's a big challenge to try and get. But it can be worth it if you've been aiming to that, because it can get you a lot of points.
Yeah, and there are, speaking of those big buildings too, there are like a few different ways you can go for points as well, because you can also focus on those power generators, which are worth big points if you can surround them all the way around. But yeah, those big 4x4 buildings, and it's cool that in like a 2-player game, there's only one of those that is available. So you've got to not only gun for that, but if the other person sees you and there becomes a race, that can be really tricky to get. But even if you fail at it, you can still, take those 3 buildings, and those are still strong. I think most of the buildings actually all of the buildings are worth getting. And it's pretty rare that you can build a building and you wouldn't want to.
The other part of variability is the variety of tiles. And for the most part, the tiles will have 2, maybe 3 terrains, maybe 1 gear and 1 relic. But you do get some that are all one color, maybe a couple of relics on them. And so just the different tiles and the order in which they come out will lead to different strategies for how you're building your town.
And definitely there will be times where you need something so specific and you're really hoping it comes out. And the game does start you with 3 that are kind of these secret tiles that are just yours. And it makes a little bit of a difference because you can build to that knowing that you've got that. But those are things, I didn't even look at those for a few games. Like, it took a few games for me to think like, oh, I can think ahead. And it's not like it's a heavy game, but I think it's just naturally, you see those ones face up, you kind of forget about these ones that are over here. But it is a strategy you can have. But there are certainly times where you just need a specific tile. You're really hoping that comes out of the market. And that can make a big difference on your game, obviously, like it can in games like this. But the other thing that makes a big difference is going to be player count. So let's talk about that.
This game plays for 2 to 4 players, and the main way that it changes based on player count will be the buildings. So at more players, there are going to be more buildings available, but there'll be more competition for those buildings. And depending on what types of buildings are chosen, you might be able to influence more people.
Yeah, there are there's one specific building that I can think of where it gives a relic to both people who are next to you. So obviously there's only one person, that's kind of half as powerful because it's only going to be one person that's next to you. And there are a few, I think, that are like that though, where you're choosing a player to throw junk at. And so that's going to build a little animosity. Whereas in 2 players, it's like, well, she has to throw it at me, so I'm not going to take it. I am still going to take it a bit personally, but I'm not going to take it so personally. The other thing that is going to change a bit too is that market, and also the potential for hate drafting as well, because this game doesn't have a lot of that, because you definitely want to build your own thing, and it's not that often that someone needs such a specific tile that you can steal. But there have been times, I know that our last game, Jess really wanted one of those that was all 4 of one color. That was perfectly going to fit for her. It was perfectly going to make a group of 7. And so I, of course, took that. And to make it even worse, I took it and I looked at her and I was like, just so you know, I don't even want this. Just to make it even meaner. Even thinking about it now fills me with glee. But so there are those opportunities to be mean and to hate draft and to have that interaction still. But I think she still won because I did not need that tile and I just shot myself in the foot.
Yeah, it's usually not optimal to do it, but it does present the opportunity. And with more players, the market is going to shift more by the time it comes back to your turn. So that can be good good if you're finding like you don't want the stuff that's currently available, but that can be bad if you are like, ooh, I like most of these and I hope they're still around when it comes to my turn.
Yeah, and it obviously also adds a little bit of time, but this game's very fast. Like these are tiny little turns that you're taking, so that is not going to be you're never going to find yourself sitting there thinking, oh, when's it going to come back to me? It's going to come back to you in seconds. Like it's a very quick game, so that's not going to be a huge part of that. But let's move on then to components.
So my favorite component is the boxes. All of the 3 sets of buildings come in boxes, so it makes it nice and easy to set up. And there is a box too for like the junk relic tokens and the inhabitants. So all of that makes setup really straightforward.
Yeah, and this was a bit of a surprise to me because it has Hasbro on the box. And I, fairly or not, have come to expect a little bit less from Hasbro games. They're just, at least in my head, I don't know if this is all the way true, so don't yell at me if it's not, but it seems like there's games that I remember having as a kid, and then I look at the newer versions and I think, they kind of made them not as nice. This one doesn't really go in that direction. I think the tiles are nice and thick. All of the people that you're putting down on your buildings are made of wood. And there's 2 different styles of them. There's one with shades and one with, I think, a shovel. And just all of the bits are like pretty solid. I would say that the buildings that go on top maybe are a little bit thin, and the soccer ball / junk, and that is like a 2-sided token to save on bits a little bit, is also maybe a little bit thin, but they're going on top of these chunky tiles already, so I don't see that as a problem at all. But overall, I was very pleasantly surprised by how this looked, thinking that this is a game that's, from Hasbro going into a mass market setting.
Yeah, definitely. And if you look closely at the buildings, I think they look really cool. I will say the main tiles are thick. They're not like glossy like King Domino. So just shifting expectations a little bit. And the terrain is quite simple, but that simplicity does make it really easy to tell at a glance what type of terrain it is, which is really important. I will say though, when I looked at the cover looks like really cool and like this really amazing world, and you don't quite get that in the game. I think the buildings hint at it, but overall it's mostly just the terrain with like some buildings on it, as opposed to building this whole world when you see the cover.
Yeah, that is fair, because you get maybe 5-6 buildings that you're going to end up putting in your land by the end of the game, and yeah, like you say, those buildings are cool. You need to look at them close to really get the detail. The detail's there, but you really need to look at it. But yeah, most of those tiles are, they're orange, they're green, they're brown, and that's just what they are. But yeah, they do a decent job.
The other thing I want to mention is the rule book. And I found for the basics of how to play, I felt like it was pretty clear, but there were a couple of buildings when I could have used a little bit more clarification that was missing.
Yeah, those inside the book just has almost the exact same text that is on the actual card. So I do feel like come on, give me a little bit more explanation for this. And I know a few people online were saying that they had a little bit of trouble picking up the rules from it. We didn't have a big problem with it. I thought the rulebook mostly was fine, but we played a lot of games that look like this, and perhaps if you're a brand new gamer, you may stumble on it a bit. So hopefully people can, find BGG, find those things. There is a QR code inside the rulebook though that does take you to an instructional video, so I think that could be helpful for a lot of folks.
Yeah, and the broad strokes of how you play is also included on the main game board, which is great. But let's move on to final thoughts.
So as I have kind of alluded to a few times, this is from Hasbro and Avalon Hill, and I do believe that the intention here is to kind of bridge a little bit the hobby gaming audience and that mass market audience, and I almost feel like I need to review it for both. I want to push against that instinct a little bit. I'm still going to do it a little bit. So I think it's cool that this is going to be on shelves of stuff like Walmart and John Lewis. It reminds me a little bit of what Buffalo Games has been doing with the Phil Walker Harding games like Planted and Summer Camp, which I think are really solid games. It reminds me a little bit of that, where I'm happy that people are going to play games that I think are fairly decent. But for the hobby audience, this is a little bit like you're going to see those shades of King Domino, especially King Domino Origins and Moon River and that sort of thing in here. And those buildings do make a difference. They are a little bit different, but if you've got a lot of tile placement games, this, you've seen a lot of this stuff already, and it's going to be up to you how much those different buildings, change that up for you and how much of a draw that is. It is Erik Lang, generally does pretty solid work, but just kind of take in those caveats.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it does have a really cool theme. I do wish the theme came out just a little bit more, but it is an interesting theme and it plays really quickly. At 2 players, it plays in 25 minutes. So it's an interesting puzzle that has enough different layers to it with those different buildings. So I think really it is reminiscent of a lot of other tile placement games, but it is solid, it's fun, we had a fun time playing it, and it has an interesting theme.
And that is it. That is Life in Reterra. Have you played Life in Reterra? What other tile placement games have you played recently that you enjoyed?
Thank you so much for watching. As usual, please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.